The cafe hummed with the usual afternoon chaos. Clinking silverware, impatient voices, the hiss of the espresso machine fighting to be heard above it all. In the center of this storm moved Marcus, a tall figure with shoulders that seemed to carry more than just serving trays. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of a tray loaded with coffee cups, and for the briefest moment, the porcelain rattled like wind chimes in a hurricane. No one noticed, or perhaps they chose not to. In a world that moved too fast, Marcus had become invisible, just another waiter hustling between tables. His story written in the scars no one cared to read. If you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment about a time someone saw you when you felt invisible. Share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. Marcus had been working at Romano's Bistro for 3 years, ever since the accident that had stolen everything from him. Before that day, his hands had been his fortune. Steady, precise, miraculous. He had been a surgeon, one of the best in the city, known for performing operations that others deemed impossible. Children with congenital heart defects, accident victims hanging by a thread, mothers who needed just one more chance. Marcus had given them all new beginnings with those gifted hands. His colleagues had called him the miracle worker, and he had worn that title with quiet pride, never knowing how quickly miracles could turn to dust. The accident had happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Marcus had been driving home after a 30-hour shift, his mind still replaying the successful surgery he had just completed on a 6-year-old girl. He never saw the drunk driver run the red light. The collision had been devastating, trapping him in twisted metal for nearly 2 hours while firefighters worked to free him. When he finally woke up in the hospital, a patient in the very place where he had once been a god, the neurologist's face told him everything before any words were spoken. The nerve damage was extensive. His hands would never be steady again. Surgery was no longer possible. The tremors had started immediately after the accident and never stopped. Some days they were barely noticeable, a slight quiver that he could almost hide. Other days, like today, his hands shook as if they were trying to escape from his body, as if they were as desperate to forget what they once were as Marcus himself. He had tried everything: physical therapy, medications, experimental treatments that drained his savings and gave nothing in return except false hope. The medical board had been sympathetic but firm. A surgeon who couldn't hold a scalpel steady wasn't a surgeon at all. His license had been suspended indefinitely, a clinical word that really meant forever. The fall from grace had been swift and brutal. The colleagues who had once sought his advice now avoided his calls. The hospital that had celebrated him with plaques and ceremonies offered him a consulting position so insulting he had walked out halfway through the interview. His wife, Sarah, had tried to be supportive at first, but Marcus had seen the way she looked at him, not with pity, which he could have endured, but with a creeping disappointment that poisoned everything between them. Within a year, she was gone, taking with her the last remnants of the life he had built. The divorce papers had arrived on the same day he started his job at Romano's, as if the universe wanted to make sure he understood just how far he had fallen. Working as a waiter was its own special kind of torture for someone who had once held human hearts in his hands. The customers looked through him as if he were made of glass, their eyes sliding past him to focus on their phones, their conversations, their self-important lives. They snapped their fingers when they wanted his attention, sighed dramatically when he took too long, and never once wondered why his hands shook when he set down their plates. To them, he was nothing, a servant, a background character in the story of their day. Marcus had learned to accept this invisibility, had even come to prefer it. Being seen meant being pitied, and he had endured enough pity to last several lifetimes. On this particular afternoon, the cafe was especially crowded. A business lunch crowd had descended like locusts, filling every table and demanding immediate service with the entitlement of people who had never known real hardship. Marcus moved between tables with practiced efficiency, his body remembering the choreography even as his hands betrayed him with their constant trembling. He had just finished delivering salads to a table of lawyers who hadn't looked up from their documents when he felt it, the tray beginning to slip from his grip. Time seemed to slow as he watched 3 glasses of ice water tilt toward the edge, gravity taking hold with inevitable cruelty. The crash was spectacular. Glass shattered across the tile floor, water spreading in a puddle that reflected the overhead lights like a broken mirror. The entire cafe fell silent, all eyes suddenly fixed on Marcus in the center of the disaster. His hands were still outstretched, still trembling, now empty of everything except shame. The manager, Mr. Romano, appeared from the kitchen with a face like a thundercloud, already moving toward him with words of dismissal forming on his lips. Marcus stood frozen, waiting for the final humiliation, for the loss of even this humble job that was all he had left. Then a voice cut through the silence. A woman stood up from a corner table, moving toward him with purposeful strides. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see through the layers of defeat Marcus had wrapped around himself like armor. She knelt beside him, ignoring the water soaking into her expensive-looking dress, and did something no one had done in 3 years. She took his trembling hands in hers and held them steady, her grip firm and warm and impossibly gentle. Marcus tried to pull away, tried to hide the evidence of his brokenness, but she held on. Her voice was soft but carried across the silent cafe. She asked him if he was the Marcus Chen who had performed emergency surgery on her grandson 5 years ago, who had repaired a heart defect that 3 other surgeons had said was inoperable, who had given her family 4 extra years with a child they had been prepared to lose. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he had built to keep the past at bay. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. The woman smiled, tears streaming down her face, and told him that her grandson was now 10 years old, healthy and strong, playing soccer and dreaming of becoming a doctor himself. She told him that Marcus's hands had given her grandson a future, and that shaking or steady, those hands would always be miraculous to her. The cafe remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. People were listening now, really listening, seeing Marcus for the first time not as a clumsy waiter but as a human being with a story worth knowing. The woman turned to address the room, her voice gaining strength. She explained who Marcus was, what he had been, what he had sacrificed in service to others. She talked about the children he had saved, the families he had kept whole, the countless miracles he had performed before his own tragedy struck. When she finished, something extraordinary happened. The lawyer who had complained about his salad stood up and began to clap. Others joined him, and within seconds the entire cafe was applauding, standing, looking at Marcus with eyes that finally saw him. If this story has touched your heart, if it reminded you that everyone has a hidden story worth knowing, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment below, and sharing it with your friends and family. Stories like Marcus's deserve to be heard. Mr. Romano approached, but instead of the termination Marcus expected, the manager placed a hand on his shoulder and apologized for not seeing him, really seeing him before now over the next hour, as Marcus cleaned up the broken glass with hands that still trembled, but somehow felt lighter. People approached him one by one. Some remembered him from his days at the hospital. Others simply wanted to shake the hand of someone who had dedicated his life to healing. A man who owned a medical equipment company offered him a consulting position, saying his knowledge was too valuable to waste. A woman who ran a nonprofit asked if he would consider teaching medical students about the human side of surgery, about grace and perseverance in the face of loss. But it was the silver-haired woman, Mrs. Patterson, he learned, who changed everything. She told him about a new research program at the university, one focused on helping surgeons recover from career-ending injuries. She had connections there, she said, and would make calls. She couldn't promise his hands would ever be steady enough for surgery again, but she could promise he wouldn't face the journey alone. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus felt something he had thought was gone forever. Hope, fragile as glass but real nonetheless. Before we end, if Marcus's story moved you, if it made you think about the invisible people in your own life who might be carrying hidden wounds, please take a moment to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your words matter, and they might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. That evening, after his shift ended, Marcus stood outside the cafe and looked at his hands in the fading light. They were still trembling, still broken, still incapable of the precision that had once defined him. But Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in his mind. These hands had given her grandson a future, and trembling or steady, they would always be miraculous. Perhaps, Marcus thought, a miracle wasn't about perfection. Perhaps it was about showing up even when everything was broken, about continuing to reach out even when your hands wouldn't stop shaking, about being seen and seeing others in return. He had spent 3 years believing his story was over, that the accident had stolen not just his career but his worth. But today, a stranger had noticed his hands and remembered not what they couldn't do anymore, but what they had once accomplished. And in that recognition, in that simple act of seeing him, Marcus found something he hadn't realized he had lost. The understanding that his value had never been in his steady hands, but in his healing heart. And that was something no accident could ever take away. The world was full of invisible people carrying invisible wounds, waiting for someone to notice, to care, to remember that everyone has a story worth knowing. Marcus walked home that evening with trembling hands and a steady heart, ready to discover what the next chapter might hold. Knowing now that his story was far from over, it was simply beginning again.